Okay, so welcome to everybody who's managed to make it in, and hopefully folks that haven't will be showing up pretty soon if they find their way here. And of course, people can kind of come in and out as they see fit. Um, but I really want to think about this as a workshop, in part because I think it's the area of thinking about what civil discourse is, or how we ought to be talking to each other within what you might broadly think of as a public sphere that's the most unsettled. It literally changes every day. If you got a chance to look at any of the links that were sent out with the invitation, you saw sort of, I think, kind of how rich and difficult the arguments that people make about the practices that they either prefer for themselves, if they're people that believe in calling out or something like that. But also, I think how rich, at least potentially, if you look for them, the arguments about what people shouldn't do are. I mean, this is an area of difficult ethics, and of difficult practice, and nobody has it right. I don't know if we'll get to them, but I stuck on some examples that are literally from my last couple of days on social media, where I've had to make, spot decisions where my logic sometimes for how I engage are inconsistent, and that's probably true for everybody. So this can be maybe a good session where we all help each other think about how we make those decisions. But I thought along with those links, if you had a chance to look at them or not, I thought maybe what I'd do is introduce just at the start a couple of principles to keep in mind about what makes, say, social media a potentially different landscape for civility than, say, any number of other forms, even of electronic communications like email, but also the kinds of formal interactions that we are more accustomed to thinking about in terms of civility, the actions of scholarship, the actions of how we talk to each other in workplaces and so on. Social media is like those things, but it's also different, sometimes because of the technology, sometimes because of the history. So if we look at the first slide after the introduction, the first thing I think that's worth considering is that the scale of it is staggering at times. As with every one of these other features, there's a good side to that and a bad side to that when you think about what makes for civility or the lack thereof. The good side really is that people, whatever community you identify with, whatever identity you feel is precious to you, whatever ideology, you're trying to develop or feel committed to, there's not just one person out there, there's, a zillion people. I mean, I can find, a million people to talk to if I want to, who all share a strong opinion that the first of the Star Wars prequels is a great movie or something. I mean, anything you want, it's out there to sort of feel that you're in community with. And as we've seen, not just in the United States, but all around the world, the mobilizations because of scale that people can perform through connection, through dialogue, through debate, through sharing are of extraordinary size and import. So these are, this is major. On the bad side, right, it's obvious, is you can get mobbed by 10,000 people that you've never heard of. And I don't really think, in a sense, that may have been possible in one way or another in old media and in the old public sphere. When I was an intern at the Los Angeles Times when I was an undergraduate over summer, they told me that like the most letters they'd ever gotten was about a bad editorial cartoon, and it was 10,000, 15,000 letters that were angry about the cartoon. But today you can put out a tweet and have 10,000 people mad at you that you've never heard of, and they can pile on, and there could be another 100,000, a million who've heard of it. That scale is really staggering and scary. All right, so look at the next slide. Here we go. All right, so the next thing I think that goes along with scale is the rapidity of it, right? Is social media is different in that way. All the other interactions we have through text, through speech, they have natural slowing effects. If we're going to get into a hot argument with each other, if people are going to get angry at a Charles Murray speech, whatever, there's still a kind of materiality that limits it. It has to be bodies in the same space. It has to be the kind of back and forth that verbal conversations have. If we're going to write text to each other in formal published environments, that slows things down. But social media, you know, the speed of it has gotten faster and faster and faster, along with the baseline technology, but also with a lot of cultural norms, so that a lot of people are on all the time. Some I'm not. I'm on a lot. I'm on a lot more than my colleagues, but you know, I know of people, academics and otherwise, where they're pretty much, you know, 15, 16 hours a day churning out very quick replies to a lot of things. What that means in civility terms, I think in part is it's great. We can have these conversations about something that just happened, you know, okay, they're going to vote tomorrow on the health bill, you know, and that was a thing that that had a lag built into it in the past, and in a way, therefore, blunted the kinds of responses, the kinds of conversations, the kinds of dialogues we could have. You get a chance to have support. You know, if you are a person calling somebody else out, or you're a person who feels alone in a situation, you can get 100 people, you know, sort of on your side within 5 minutes. And that can be an incredible transformation for you. The bad side's pretty obvious, right? Is that first of all, you often can't pull things back. Sometimes you can, if you're fast enough. But if you put something out there on Twitter and you think twice about it 20 minutes later, and anybody else noticed it and is upset by it, they can screenshot it. And it's there, and it's never going away at that point, even if you do delete it. There are other places where you can't really take things back. And even you know, forms of social media like Snapchat that are supposed to be ephemeral, if somebody snapshots it, they snapshot it. Snapchat tells you that now. But you know, you think it's going to go away, but if somebody wants to keep it, they're going to keep it. And so that's hard. In 1 second, you can say something you wish you could take back, and it has that sort of permanence. You can't even say, I didn't actually say that, much as Donald Trump tries. You know, there's a record of it. And of course, it means that very, very quickly, the nature of a conversation can flash to something that most of the people, even people in it, regard as incivil, rude, violating, and they can't stop it, because once it's moved to that stage, they can't sort of undo that. So we move to the next slide. All right, so this one's sort of been a debated element of social media and online discourse really since the beginning. I mean, way back to when people were calling up with modems to bulletin boards. It was an issue. The good sides of it from a civility standpoint, you know, we're very accustomed, a lot of us, to thinking of a formal public sphere with authors who write under their own names as an important part of being civil. But you know, you think about those things that are true, that somebody needs to say, those testimonies that need to be given by people who are living in authoritarian situations, by people who are living in dysfunctional institutions. And anonymity in a social media environment lets that kind of truth circulate and become a part of what we know in new ways. It's important. It lets people who are dealing with really serious violations or intrusions potentially share that and make that part of our common knowledge about the world, as well as about how to help that person. Bad side, it's super obvious at this point. You'll see in a minute, I was looking for things that have the keyword Swarthmore in it in Twitter. I keep a column open to that. And about you know, a certain percentage of them, it depends on what's going on, are coming from bots, basically. I mean, from automated, programmed, mysteriously located entities that are circulating a whole bunch of mostly conservative, but there are some kind of liberal left-wing bots too, that just kind of recirculate certain messages. And those are anonymous, and they're not only anonymous, they're not in some sense human. That's pretty hard to think about how to engage that in a civil sense, is somebody who's either anonymous in order to manipulate you, to hurt you, or may not even be a human being, but in fact a programmed entity that's just sort of there. So anonymity is a big part of the picture of trying to figure out what kind of civility is possible in an online environment, in a social media environment, and what isn't. I mentioned here also on the slide, I mean, the earliest research on what people sometimes do with anonymity was actually famously done by Ken Gergen here at Swarthmore in the psychology department. And Ken did this very famous experiment that's called Deviance in the Dark, where he sort of was looking at, well, what do people do if they think they're not being watched? And the answer is mostly they don't do nice things. They do things that they think that they shouldn't do, but things that they think they can get away with. So we move to the next slide. All right, so this is, I mean, and in the questions and conversation when we get to it, you know, let's not presume that anybody here has any particular knowledge of social media. So if you're just plain old curious about what the hell some of this is, or what that application is, or what any of these words are, or what the phenomena are, let's talk about those things in a way that is pretty open to different levels of knowledge and experience. But basically what I'm thinking about here is that social media does have these unique, sometimes, algorithmic or code-based things that are built into the platforms that we interact in, and sometimes kind of cultural propositions about how we interact with each other that affect what's possible around being civil or uncivil. So on one hand, we can use social media to create new ways to feel safe with one another, especially people that we feel connected to through identity, through community, through common interests. We can use social media if we know how to kind of use what people call filter bubbles, the kinds of people who we follow, the people that we block from following us, to create conversations that exclude people that are deliberately hostile or malicious, which in our real lives we often can't do. In our workplaces, in our neighborhoods, in our communities, we can't just mute or block or filter out a person who's determined in some kind of dialogue or conversation to do us harm. I mean, who has malicious ends for that conversation. And we can share. The bad side is been talked about a lot in the context of this last election, is if your filter bubbles are very strong, meaning if you are following a set of people that you follow because they're like you or because you like their ideas, and you are unfollowing or refusing to follow people that you don't, you're blocking them, you're muting them, you're never subscribing to them, you're never looking at what they post, you start to get a pretty strange and distorted idea of what's actually around you. And it starts to malform your ability to have a conversation with what's actually around you if and when that moment comes that you have to. And you just need to imagine, if you could make invisible all the people you don't want to talk to in a physical material environment, but they were still there and still able to hurt you, do things with you, do things to your life, you would be in a profound state of vulnerability. If I didn't know that some people who could actually do things to me were right there next to me, I would be in danger. And that's often what happens in social media when your filter bubbles are too strong or too intense. You lose knowledge about the way the world really is, and you lose capacity you lose an ability to talk to unlike people. And I think we can feel pretty confident that there are risks to that we are witnessing, experiencing, seeing, and not just in the United States, but fairly globally. Maybe we move ahead to the next slide. All right, so this I think is the other thing. It's what I like best about Twitter still, even though I don't particularly enjoy Twitter anymore compared to how I felt about it when I was first active on it. It's not true about all platforms or social media outlets. I don't think it's true about Facebook as much. But leveling in this context is, on Twitter in particular, I can talk to anybody as long as they haven't muted me, blocked me, reported me. In other words, as long as they don't have some prior way of shoving me out of the picture, I can send a tweet to real Donald Trump. I can send a tweet to a celebrity that I'm interested in. I can send a tweet to Bret Stephens at the New York Times after I get irritated reading his column. And if he chooses or she chooses the person that I'm tweeting to, they can respond to it. And a reasonable amount of the time, some folks at least do. That's different than a lot of kind of past modes of conversation across a public sphere, where there were many, many, many layers that protected people who were prominent or famous or powerful from ever having to sort of read and hear those comments in real time from people, and ever having the opportunity or the responsibility to respond to them. So it's a potentially new landscape for, well, how does one do that properly? Both how does one get the attention of people, and what should one expect in return? And it does let you talk about things that would have been previously private about a powerful person in a context where they may feel obliged, in fact, to speak to that, to address it, to kind of respond to it. Bad side, again, is I think kind of the thing that we've been thinking about a lot more as a public culture lately, is it lets malicious people very badly abuse famous people who are on Twitter. And there are especially women and women of color who've had to essentially drop out of that environment and many other social media environments because they're getting constant death threats, rape threats, constant attacks, sort of scurrilous racism thrown at them. That creates a condition of vulnerability for people who, powerful or not, want to participate in the public culture as it is. And that's partly because of this feature. It's also the way that a lot of fake news enters the world, is that people, because it's a more level environment, amateurs, people who are actively making stuff up, operate in a way where it's much harder to figure out who's a valuable speaker, who's a high information speaker. And in particular, people use that often to harass the folks that are high value or high information speakers. This happens to climate scientists a lot, is if they're in social media and they're in social media identified as climate scientists, they get just a constant barrage of messages from people, some of them very deliberately trollish, but other people who, just don't know all that much, but confidently state things about the hockey stick graph or any number of other things just to gum up the works, or sometimes out of honest intent. So that creates a complicated landscape for, well, what's fair here to expect of people? What do they have to talk to? What do they not have to talk to? Where is this an affordance in terms of civility, and where is it a deficit? So if we move to the next slide. All right, so this is really what I want to talk about with folks, and we can kind of roll through it. And I have some concrete examples on the other slides if we run out of space, but the links that I sent also might fill up some reference points, but I'm also interested in hearing everybody else's experiences here. And I think the conversation about what should civility be, how do you practice it, what do you do in a social media environment, really breaks into these two really different categories. The one is, the kind of classic concern of a sort of, of a stoic in philosophical terms, is what can I control? What are the rules I ought to follow, independent of what everybody else is doing, what everybody else is saying, whatever platform I'm on, whatever affordances of the technology I have, what do I need to do? What's right and wrong about my practice? And then, what's right and wrong about the intentional practices of others that I see? Where am I going to do, say, what the writer for the Briarpatch magazine, has this very, I think, kind of subtle, layered critique of call-out culture, where he says we should have call-in culture instead. He's making a statement about not just his own practices, but other people's, that are about what he thinks they can intentionally control. And then, what do we do if we think people are behaving in a really wrong fashion? Think about all those effects I mentioned: scale, rapidity. It's sort of hard to know. What do you do about 10,000 people who in the last 10 seconds have piled on a tweet? What do you do if you see something like what John Ronson talks about with this woman, Justine Sacco, who made an ill-advised joke about AIDS before getting on a plane, and then found that by the time she landed, she was an international sort of cause célèbre as a notorious racist. If you see that happening, is there a way to interrupt it? Is there anything you can do when in your judgment something incivil is happening in a social media environment? We can talk about that a lot. I think those are the most interesting questions lie in there. The design questions are a different question, but they often inflect our behaviors in ways that we're not fully conscious of, and maybe we can't really control. Facebook, by its methods of sort of getting you to like and interact with things, is making decisions about what to show you algorithmically, and that's making decisions in turn about what you speak to and don't speak to. Many environments are trying to actually inflame you, make you mad, annoy you, tempt you into being uncivil to someone, because they know that's actually what creates the kind of pile-on that creates an environment that people want to look at, that kind of brings the eyeballs and the clicks into that environment, that sells the ads. So we have to think about that. We have to not be naive about the role that design plays. But I think, to me, the most interesting human problems here are about what do we do? What should we do? What do we do? What do we think we should do about other people and the ways that they behave? So I think if we kind of focus on that, and then I'm just curious to see what kinds of questions come in that general sense from this slide, and then I can move us along and we can talk about some practical problems and see what people think about reading them. But let's start here and see what, if any, questions we've got at this point. And feel free to kind of ask me to track back to something too, if you'd like to.
Okay, I'm promoting Ben had a question. I'm going to. Ben, can you hear us?
I can hear you, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, you had a question?
Yeah, I mean, before we go on, I was just interested in your thoughts about why we should care about civility. Why you think it's important for us to be civil in the first place? Yeah.
Well, okay, so that's like an important question. I mean, you can start with the kind of classic punt that on some level any historian or anthropologist or social scientist might give you, and that's sort of my terrain, so I'll do it too, which is to say, if other people care about it, we should care about it. Meaning that the substance of what people talk about inside social media spaces is frequently about the question of what is civility? Did I behave in an uncivil way? Did you behave in an uncivil way? That a lot of the conversation inside social media is exactly this kind of meta conversation. So we should care about it almost whether or not we have any ideas ourselves about it as an object of study. If lots of people are talking about it, then it matters. I think we should care about it because for those of us who are in social media spaces, it is also something that constantly poses a set of choices about whether we should engage, how we should engage. So anytime I think that on a daily basis, you're facing choices that are meaningful to you, philosophically meaningful to you, but also pragmatically meaningful to you, meaning like if I do this wrong, what's going to happen to me? There may be consequences or outcomes that I don't like. They're worth talking about because if you're thinking about it yourself, it matters. There is, beyond that, in a way, the kind of thing that this ethics slide implies, that there may be a normative question, which is to say, we can study what people are saying about civility. We can ask whether we have practical or philosophical guidelines for ourselves that help us mediate the choices that we're making inside a social media space that we understand have something to do with civility. But we also can ask, is there a kind of civility that we want for ourselves and others that we think will produce different outcomes than the ones that we presently have not only just in social media, but in relationship to what we think social media affects. So when somebody says, I'm in favor of call-out culture, I do not, when they say, I don't find that uncivil, I do not think there's anything violating about writing a tweet that says, did you see what the dean at this school did in relationship to this sexual harassment lawsuit? We need to raise a ruckus. We need to get him fired. We need him called out. If a person says, I'm entitled to do that, they're invoking not just their own decision-making process, but a notion that that's going to produce a normative outcome that they believe in, and that it's going to produce an inhibition, not just a punishment for that one person, but an inhibition to other powerful men, other powerful professionals, to not abuse their power. So that dimension's the harder one to figure out. Well, are we sure that those outcomes follow from particular ways of behaving in social media? Are we sure that we like those outcomes independent of what we take civility to be? They're pretty hard to grapple with. I mean, you get pretty quickly into the deep terrain of philosophy. It's easier in some sense to stay with this practical problem. What should I do? What should people that I know do? What kinds of conversations do I like, and maybe some mode of inquiry about why? Those are more easily managed, but they eventually are going to point you towards that question of, well, what do I want? What do I want of my culture, my society, my world? How do I want people to be talking to one another? And if this is the way that many of us do talk to one another, are there special things that we have to think about that work in these environments or don't work?
We have another question. Let me just, sorry. See if I can get up there. Okay, this is Trudy. Trudy, can you hear us?
How you doing?
Let me see if I can.
Yeah, your mic's off, so hang on.
I'm trying to turn you on.
Hi there. Sorry about the dog.
There we go. Who else is that with you, Trudy?
This is Chia.
Hi, Chia.
She thinks she's still a puppy, even though she's not. I was thinking about how we can talk about ethics and what we believe would be ethical or what we believe should happen or would happen, but ultimately we're a bunch of Swarthmore graduates and professors sitting around having an academic discussion, and the real world, I think what you see is a kind of mob justice in a lot of these situations, putting aside the trolls and the intentional, the bullying. In the kind of Justine Seiko case, you see a mob justice. I mean, I remember watching that unfold live and like giggling about it. I didn't tweet about it, but I thought it was pretty funny. And then you get to the point where there's real world consequences for people. Now, much more serious cases like the Swarthmore graduate who, the reporter who was given a seizure by a tweet, that was prosecuted. So it strikes me that, I mean, in this slide where you talk about ethics and what's right and wrong and what we can control, and then design, there's a third element, which is law. And that is important to consider. We have some weak legal frameworks where they can prosecute, no biting, where they can prosecute harms, physical harms to somebody's health. But for example, they're not prosecuting, when people get doxxed, when their addresses are revealed and people have to move. That would be a demonstrable harm, stalker behavior, stuff like that, we don't quite have the legal framework to encompass what happens, especially when a mob of Twitter users is all collectively doing no biting. But that would be, I guess that's a third element, and I was wondering what you think about that, because our legal framework is has not caught up. And it doesn't seem like it's anybody's priority. No, it doesn't seem like it's anybody's priority to catch it up.
Right. Well, and in fact, I mean, what in particular a lot of women have found in these cases where they've been doxxed, they're being stalked by people, is that for the most part, when they go to law enforcement says either, I think for reasons, frankly, of kind of an embedded misogyny, you know, what's your problem, or, you know, just don't go play games, or don't be in that place, or don't go there, which is just another version of you were asking for it. But even when you've got a law enforcement agent who's more sensitive and is more interested in the problem, they'll often say, you know, what do you want me to do about anonymity, right? If this is somebody acting behind multiple layers of disguise of their own identity, it's at very least a serious investigative challenge to find out who they are. But secondly, even if it's 100 people, if it's half of a subreddit, if it's people where you're not even quite sure which part of it is a particular agent who can be held legally responsible, and in other cases are bots, you know, that somebody's just pointed at another account. So that we don't, there's a sense in which I'm sympathetic to a person in law enforcement who wants to do the right thing, but says, I don't even know quite what kinds of charges I can bring, how I can bring them, whether I have the investigative tools to bring them, and what it would mean to do anything about it anyway. If you look at something, there's a practice, I don't know how many people have heard about this, but it's related to what's called doxing. Doxing's exposing somebody's personal information online with the intent of getting people to sort of send threats to them, to harm them in some fashion, to kind of bring pressure on them. But there's something that's kind of related to it that's called swatting, that happens in particular in relationship to games, but social media too sometimes, where a person who has a hold of your address and your phone number will pretend to be calling. They can do this. They can reroute their calls from that phone number and claim to be held hostage in your house to a SWAT unit. And it's kind of it's just luck, I think, that nobody's been killed by a stunt like that. It's pretty easy to say, okay, we should go after that person. That's seriously dangerous stuff. And in fact, police forces have. The problem is, in a lot of cases, it turns out to be a 15-year-old, literally the proverbial 15-year-old in their parents' basement. And then I think we're kind of like, well, okay, first of all, what's the punishment for that? And secondly, it turns out that if you do punish it, because there have been some cases of this, it doesn't seem to deter the other proverbial 15-year-olds in their parents' basement. It's hard to figure out what would actually stop the tidal wave of some of the kinds of behaviors that you see in social media. Certainly it isn't going to change if we make nice Swarthmore type arguments.
I mean, I think there's a point where it becomes a policy problem, and yes, the internet is global, so you can only make laws within a certain jurisdiction, but where a SWAT team going into somebody's house, not only is that a threat to kill that person by accident, but it also is a huge misallocation of police resources, which I assume is why police actually care about that. But I could see a future in which, and I think it's an interesting discussion to discuss where would be the correct place to draw the line. I could see a future in which the internet is more legislated in a way where people engaging on certain platforms do have to have an authenticated identity and therefore can be held responsible for things. And where would you want to draw that line? At a certain point, you lose some of the positives that you discussed about social media. So that's an interesting.
Challenge number one that's really related to this policy level kind of thinking is Twitter is very aware now, I think, that they have had an historically inadequate response to abusive behavior, uncivil behavior that costs them something, meaning that's how they lose some of the celebrities, some of the kinds of attention-grabbing accounts, is people drop off the service. It creates a kind of constant problem for them that affects their staffing levels. So it has a real impact on their business. So they've started to say, okay, we're gonna kick people out. I mean, we're gonna ban people. We're gonna, knock them off the platform. So let's suppose, in a policy sense, that becomes part of a larger response that the platforms themselves and their owners and law converge on. Well, what happens the day that somebody files an abuse claim against the real Donald Trump account for some of the discourse that it engages in on Twitter? That will be exactly the crux where the kind of affordances of social media meet with this policy problem about, well, how far are you going to go to not only make people be tied to real identities, but make people responsible for a certain notion of what constitutes civil behavior.
I have a question that was just asked, and if I could read it out loud for you.
Yep.
Okay. This is from Anonymous. I'm a graduate student at Yale, where we had an incident I'm sure many of you have heard of, in which an undergraduate was filmed yelling at a professor. The video of the interaction went viral and was especially lapped up by conservative media outlets as an example of lefty students being entitled, uncivil, illiberal, etc. When I was at Swarthmore, Twitter was barely a thing. No one I knew used it except Barry Schwartz. I'm wondering whether students and professors on university campuses today are affected by these new social media phenomena, like the chance that they may be filmed and become famous. Do they worry about speaking out for fear that they may make headlines? I read Fox News, and every day there's some news story about some misbehavior on some campus. If people are, is that a good thing?
Yeah, right. So that comes back to some of those questions of kind of the bad and the good side of things. Is about, say, for example, the notion of a call-out culture is that it, in a way, what's behind the support for calling out is the notion that it will create an inhibition. I mean, that it will make it harder for people to behave in a way where they don't worry about the consequences of being abusive, oppressive, harassing, etc. So that's sort of, in a way, the hope that's embedded inside of that. The flip side of it is definitely some of the kinds of things that the question is asking about. Is if you think, even as a non-social media user, I mean, suppose you say the way to solve all of these problems about social media is not to use social media. 10 years ago, you could be the person, that made that decision and go to bed at night kind of with some confidence that social media didn't matter to you and you had made a decision for it to not matter. That's no longer true. You cannot fully opt out of it, even if you have no interest in using it, no interest in navigating these landscapes. And it's precisely actually because of things like cell phones and smartphones with cameras in them. A lot of people here, for example, still don't use Twitter. There are a small number of faculty. Interestingly enough, there's been an uptick just in the last couple of years, but it's still small. There's very few students that use it, and the ones that do mostly kind of have handles and so on that makes it non-obvious that they're speaking from Swarthmore, or that they're Swarthmore students at all, and they mostly talk about other things. It's more common, I think, to see students using Instagram, Snapchat, text messaging each other. They reluctantly will contact us on email, but they don't particularly use it a lot themselves. Relatively few faculty here use Facebook. But the point is, you do have to think hard, or you should be thinking hard, and I'm not sure everybody does, about the possibility that something you say, whether you mean to share it with the world or not, will be shared. And I feel for students, especially activist students of all kinds, because the mistakes that I know I was able to make as a student and have nobody see, or only have 10 friends and one professor see, have a chance of becoming a global level error in judgment that was momentary, that could follow me around for the rest of my life if I was a student now. And that goes sometimes for faculty too. And that's not good, I think. Even if in some cases it shows people a true, raw, real scene of interaction, or it shows people something that a person would rather keep hidden. I think for all of us to fear that something will be decontextualized and that will be used to mock or hurt us, it can't help but have an inhibiting effect on people who are aware of it. And for people who aren't aware of it, it's you want them to be aware of it because it's a real risk.
We have a comment from another participant, from Michael. He says, the law enforcement problem is an extension of the much older law enforcement problem that police don't take personal threats seriously. They never cared when the threats were in person or on the phone, and they continue not to care when the threats move online.
Yeah, and I think that's really just basically right. The interesting thing in a funny way is threatening speech in a social environment is in certain ways, or could be certain ways, if you were inclined to care and inclined to investigate, easier to trace, even in relatively ephemeral environments than, let's say, anonymous notes shoved under your door, forms of personal threats through other media. If you wanted to, you could. But in many cases, it's true that the police forces have a long history of saying that's not our job. We don't have the manpower. We're not interested.
Would you like to go to the next slide?
Yeah, let's take a look at a couple of these things, and I'll just we'll go through a couple of these, and I'll just sort of show you. This is a landscape of my having to think about sort of what I'm going to do. So I keep in the Twitter app version I use called TweetDeck, I keep a column open to Swarthmore as a keyword just because I'm curious about what's going on. And if you look, here's over the last couple of days, we got 1 million links to that Onion video, which if you haven't seen yet, you'll want to see, about the steel worker in Pennsylvania who, sort of really liked the genderqueer poetry slam that he went out and it changed his life. It's very funny. And they were all fairly friendly links, but here's some of the others. If I'm sitting there thinking, well, on any given tweet, will I ever engage about Swarthmore? And I do sometimes. I'm not going to want to tweet, engage the one that's clearly just a student kind of venting in an ambiguous way, maybe a student, Valentina's. I'm not responsible for the Swarthmore shuttle system, so whether it can go fuck itself or not, I don't really care, right? Veteran Hank appears about every 3 to 4 days with this sentiment. I'm pretty sure he's a bot. If you look at him, I'm not going to want to engage him, both because he's a bot and because I have no hope reading that if I point out to him that sanctuary campus really just means we're enforcing, our Bill of Rights level kind of right to make the police actually have a warrant if they come on campus. That's not going to create a dialogue between him and me. I did engage Lee, so I favorited it and retweeted it, and I often do that with colleagues that are promoting courses. Sarov really interested me. He's a student I might engage. He was complaining about divestment, but he was kind of thoughtful in this. And then if you look at this next slide, that proceeds from this last one. So here I've got a person, Suzanne Clement, who she says mysteriously seems pretty inappropriate to me. I know a student who was at Swarthmore. I hope they're still innocent. So I look it up, and it's a response to a thing that the right-wing site, the Daily Caller, and a couple of others that are pointed at higher ed circulated, that was about this minor controversy about a T-shirt that a student wore during an admissions tour where the admissions office asked him to cover it up, put a jacket on, and he wouldn't. And you can see the nature of most of the conversation. So you could look at that and ask, is this conversation an uncivil conversation, or is it perfectly civil within the norms of the people having the conversation with each other? It's certainly a conversation that I can't profitably enter into. I might say, look, come on, it's just a minor incident. There's a lot of things I could say to it that I might actually say to some of these folks if they were really in front of me, if we were in a diner somewhere. But in this context, there's no winning. I mean, this thread goes on and on and on. It's all sorts of folks saying, yeah, special snowflakes. But it's an interesting case of, I don't know if there's any of you who read this and think to yourself, yeah, I'd send an angry tweet, or I'd send an agreeing tweet. But to me, I look at that landscape and I think to myself, I wouldn't call it uncivil exactly, but it's a landscape where I cannot profitably be engaged with it. If we look at the next one. All right, so here's some cases of engagement on Twitter from today, I think. The first one is about a debate that I'm finding very distressing about a young philosopher who has tried to publish an article in a feminist journal in which she argued that Rachel Dolezal, the woman who was a white woman who pretended to be African-American, who got a lot of attention, is an example of transracialism. And if transracialism is not okay, what does that imply for the ways in which we argue that transgenderism is okay? And she's gotten a lot of very, very unpleasant and negative attention from other scholars. This person here was complaining, and you can see I had a doubt about one thing. It probably won't surprise you that he didn't engage me in return. He's a scholar, I'm a scholar, but that conversation isn't going any further. On the other hand, you can see this conversation here where we were going on with each other. This is Ian Bogost, who's at Georgia Tech. It was a very interesting contrarian thinker about a whole set of things. Oops. But Kathy Davidson, who's at CUNY, who's spoken at Swarthmore in the past. Dave Mazzella, who's an early modern English writer. And these are scholars who all of us have had conversations before. And we got pretty testy with each other talking about accreditation. But this, to me, would be a great model of civility. We stuck with each other. We kept the conversation going. We clarified what we were really debating about, what the stakes were. We continued to disagree in certain ways. It's almost a classic model of what people expect civility to be. But it's probably only possible because we're in the same professional worlds. We've worked up a stake in having a conversation with each other. If we were complete strangers, I don't know that Ian would have responded to me or vice versa. I don't know that I would have bothered. So if you want to think about, well, what if that's a civil conversation, what makes it possible? And then maybe if we look at the next one. All right, so here on the one side, you can see me in a private message on Facebook. I've left the person's name off. That's me talking, and that's not very civil. So as I reread that, I'm trying to decide, was that appropriate? This is a person who's been talking with me in online media for about 15 years, and I got pretty irritated. So when I think about the question of the ethics of things, as I reread that, I have to ask myself, am I entitled to say after 15 years, hey, it's me, don't give me this stuff that you're throwing at me, this tendentious crap. Am I entitled to get angry? Do I have a relationship or a standing with that person? But the consequence is that the two of us are now not in each other's Facebook networks, and he's a fairly conservative Mormon thinker who works in digital technology and digital studies. And now, that was an interesting bridge that we built, and I burned it. So it's an interesting kind of question of what to think about. This other one is the beginning of a very long, it's only 288 this morning, it's probably longer now, conversation about that transracialism, transgender argument. And you can see it's not beginning in a very happy way. It doesn't get any better. It's pretty contentious. And so is that civil? Well, I think so. Everybody is staying in the conversation. It's not a nice conversation. And the stakes for the young philosopher, I think, are very high. So it's not as if this is just angels on a head of a pin in that sense. It means something to one person's career and life. So those are just some examples. These are like kind of torn from real life social media. But they're the decisions that anybody who even has a minimal presence has to make on a daily basis. Should I reply? Will I reply? What's going on there? Is that bad? Is that good? Is that fair? Is that unfair?
Should we, do you have one more slide?
I was just thinking about the kind of parameters for discourse that my parents set for me as a kid, and how they probably apply here too in some really basic way, which is to say, think before you talk. You can't take something back once you've said it. And if you can't say something nice, don't say anything at all. It seems to me that those sorts of basic rules of discourse might be translatable to this context, even though that is clearly not the kind of prevailing set of values that tend to be applied.
Right. So, I mean, it seems to me social media poses two challenges to those kind of baseline ethics that I think a lot of people, if you ask them, what ought you to do? You know, you're a good person, you want to be a good person, how should you talk to other people? Many of those rules would come out in many people's backgrounds of all ages, I think, from, you know, teenagers all the way up. They might put them differently, but, you know, you'd find a pretty rough equivalence across a very broad generational, cultural, community landscape. The interesting problem, it seems to me, is sort of twofold. The one is that the environment itself multiplies chances to violate those basic guidelines. Meaning, everybody knows, everybody who's ever gone to a Thanksgiving dinner, that there are certain environments that multiply the chance of saying something you wish you had said, of saying something not nice that you shouldn't have said, etc. Social media gives you opportunities to make those mistakes about once every 10 minutes if you're fairly active. Even if you're not, it's a pretty constant kind of thing to navigate. The amount of communication, the amount of conversation that we're having, the scale of conversations is dramatically upped. I think the second problem is the Thanksgiving dinner analogy works here too. If you are in the kind of family situation where Thanksgiving dinner has long since lost adherence to those rules, i.e. it's pretty guaranteed that every single year Thanksgiving dinner is going to be a bad scene, and no one will stay inside the bounds of the rules. What's your response? You really almost have only two choices: to not be at Thanksgiving dinner. Well, three: not be there, not say anything, which, as you could tell from me, would be pretty hard, or to accept that the culture of Thanksgiving dinner has changed and those rules no longer apply. And that, I think, is the situation where a lot of us are in social media, is that cultures of social media that we may have preferred at other times or that have applied in other platforms are routinely being violated across a huge landscape, and you cannot choose anymore to have the kinds of conversations following the kinds of rules that you would prefer if you want to be in many of those conversations.
So accepting that the culture has changed and that you're going to Thanksgiving dinner, do you have some kind of general parameters that you abide by and might recommend?
I mean, to me, you see, I think maybe in those examples, how I navigate it, which is, first of all, every once in a while, I lose my cool. And when I lose my cool, I try not to beat myself up about it too bad. But I also try not to give myself too much of a justification. I try not to say, you were right. You know, I try to think, why did you do that? Was it worth it? Was it necessary? I try to stay away from the conversations where I know there's just no chance to be the kind of presence I want to be. And that just means I have to be out of some rooms, and they may be important rooms, rooms where things are happening, but I have to be out of them. I try to be almost a hyper real version of myself, so that one of the things I dislike about my own social media presence as it's developed over many years is it's pretty humorless. It's long, I overwrite, and I overwrite partly because I want to be so careful. I want to pull stuff out and not be snippy and quippy. when I'm snippy and quippy, I'm a better writer, but I'm mean, and I don't want mostly to give in to that. So, you know, you try to curate your presence as well as you can, and you stay away from, say, the Thanksgiving dinner conversations. You just know there's no hope of even saying anything edgewise that won't be super unpleasant. But you accept maybe the moments where, say, there's a rollicking conversation that's a little rude and a little crude, but that you're willing to be in it. I mean, I joined in the general low-level cruelty towards David Brooks this morning because his wedding reception registry list was found online. And so everybody was like, what does he need with, come on, surely he has measuring cups by now. Okay, I did it, So maybe there are rooms that are a little cruel, a little uncivil, but that have their pleasures and their legitimacy that you let yourself be in. Or maybe you just go all out because you think there's something important to putting up your dukes and fighting with everybody at Thanksgiving dinner.
Eric has a question.
Yeah, hey, Eric.
So I guess my question is sort of, so I'm currently in medical school, and I'm about to apply to residency. One of the big things that we keep constantly discussing, that I'm taught all the time, is that delete all of your social media accounts, delete everything that has any form of an internet presence. And I think that's one of the things that I guess we're having this discussion about sort of engaging in social media, but I feel I'm a total sort of silent troll on the internet. I spend oodles of time that I could be learning about an organ system, reading Twitter audio accounts, but at the same time I feel like I have zero place to engage in those, because the real harms to me would be an absolute ending of my career in any functional way in my chosen profession. And I think that's really also broadly true of a lot of other professions, like lawyers, doctors, I mean, even politicians to a real sense, right? And I wonder if, and this is sort of to this topic, but slightly off, it's do you think that this sort of new social media landscape is fundamentally altering the kinds of voices that are allowed to be in these spaces and to engage?
Yeah, I mean, there's one sense in which, if you think about kind of professional respectability, middle-class respectability in a very deep sense, some of this counsel would have always been given all the way back into the 19th century, about the proper people to be present in certain kinds of public conversations and the people who shouldn't be. And sometimes it really would have been, some professionals, some educated people, some proper people, pretty much all women at a certain kind of moment of domestic conservatism and patriarchy would have been told, you shouldn't be there. You shouldn't be mixing it up in that vulgar newspaper. You shouldn't be writing those pamphlets. So there's one way in which we don't want to over exaggerate the kind of novelty of an advice to people that certain kinds of propriety, certain kinds of professional lives require a form of, anonymity, almost, of kind of seclusion from public debate. And the same struggles have often come up is, well, what do you do if you're one of those people that's being given that advice, and yet you feel that you have a right, an obligation, a need to be involved in a public sort of discussion of great import? And what do you do then? And the answer in a lot of cases is people just decide to be brave or to be daring or to be foolhardy, and they enter in the lists. And sometimes they regret it and sometimes they don't. I think the harder part, though, is if the kind of the mature voices, the interesting people, the real range of folks who have ideas and thoughts look at social media and say, it's too risky, it's too dangerous, it's too unpleasant, and they disappear, then all of those things get worse. the risk gets worse, the unpleasantness gets worse, the kind of rudeness and uncivil character of it gets worse. I feel for myself that that's what's happened with Twitter, is as it's become a more unpleasant environment, a more abusive environment, a more risky environment, I see lots of people whose presence I valued disappearing. I say much less than I used to on it, and I use it really almost only as a pointer to information that I've and writing somewhere else that I like. And that feels, unfortunate, because it was a more exciting space for dialogue between unlike people in its earliest incarnations, its earliest years. There's an open source app called Mastodon that launched to some degree of fanfare a couple of weeks back that's sort of Twitter-like. And it was pretty hilarious because for about 4 days, it was all these people saying, oh, this is like early Twitter. I miss early Twitter so much. And it was really good. I mean, it was really good conversations. And then it started to be less good. So, I think I find it tragic if you and other people ultimately feel or are being told you don't dare be involved in any of this, because some of our public life is being worked out in these spaces, all the more so right now that we have a president who, who knows what he'll say at 12:30 a.m. on any given day. But it's determinative, actually, of some of the outcomes in our public life is what he does say. It seems a shame that lots of people who might have really good things to say are saying, I can't get anywhere near that conversational or public space.
We're putting everyone on camera who wants to be on camera. Turn off your camera if you don't want to be on camera, just so we can all say hi to each other. And I wanted to, we didn't have Lucy here at the beginning, but Lucy, if you could say some words about what this project is for the remote seminar and, final questions.
You're muted, Lucy. Here you go.
Thanks. My task this evening was to introduce the seminar and to introduce Tim. I think at this point he has successfully introduced himself, but direct everyone to his blog, which is outstanding. The Alumni Council conceived of these alumni remote seminar series as a way to engage alums in the substantive things that we miss about the college. This is the third series, and we'll be hopefully doing one each semester going forward. If you have ideas for general topics, or you have a professor in mind you think would be a good addition, or you yourself are a specialist and are interested in leading a session, we would love to hear from you. So feel free to reach out to Alumni Council or to me directly, and we can try to make it happen. This particular session is interesting because prior to the election, the folks on Alumni Council who were spearheading this really felt like because of the change in discourse in the country, this would be a great fit for the spring semester. And lo and behold, it's an even better fit than we could have anticipated then. So I really appreciate Tim, you taking the time to do this for us, and all of you for tuning in tonight. Do you want to go on for a few extra minutes, Tim, since we got started late, and take a few more questions?
Sure, I'm glad to take any more questions, comments, thoughts, hear about other people's ways of navigating these kind of same dilemmas and difficulties.
It's made out of different parts, that long
Maybe,
not entirely clear.
hold on just a second.
Answer is yes.
Hold on just a moment. Can you hear me? No?
Yeah, all over the floor,
okay.
so then I had to clean it out. I don't know if you can tell, but
So
I put away a lot of stuff.
I'm going to mute everybody because there are other conversations happening. So if you have a question, can you raise your hand and then I will unmute you? So, Tim, can you still hear me? Tim, are you on?
Yep.
Okay.
Hi.
So I think, so we don't hear 30 people talking at the same time. It's probably
Right.
easier for questions if people raise their hand, and I'll unmute your screen if you have a question, or if, I know you had, I think maybe one more slide left, I'm not sure.
Yes. I probably get, I think it's, I'm trying to remember what I'd put on it. Is another one of these sort of like, now what to do kinds of problems here.
Hold on, let me get the last slide here up. Oh, no, maybe
No,
not.
that was it.
That was
Yeah. Yeah. So that was one. I mean, I was looking for a, you know, an interesting sort of Twitter spat of some kind. You know, I mean, I think there were, one of the things I sort of was sawing kind of a little bit incubating today around the David Brooks thing was people were starting to talk about, you know, at what point does that become too cruel? And I think that's another interesting question here, sort of in any discussion about civility. Is civility's sort of opposite number is honesty on some level. You know, one of the kinds of things that folks in academia, when civility gets invoked, say around that Yale case, the Christakis case, around the case at Missouri where the junior professor was fired over intervening to kind of kick a cameraman out of a protest, and so on, is whether, you know, at what point does civility become a weapon by people who are fairly comfortable to prevent people from sharing uncomfortable truths? At what point does it become something that protects the powerful in the situation that they're in? And I see that kind of being asked every day. And it's only partially a question about civility. There's a kind of normative notion about who's right and who's wrong, who's just and who's not, who's fair and who's unfair embedded inside of that. I mean, so that if you think you're being mean, or you think you're being uncivil to someone you think deserves it, it makes it a lot easier to be that way. And I'm not sure that there's anybody, going back a little bit to Lucy's sort of baseline ethical rules, who's good enough to never convince themselves that somebody deserved it. You know, that there are contexts in which I think a certain kind of cruelty, of bluntness, of expression is pretty hard to choke back. Now, David Brooks isn't the person that I would think would deserve it, but there are others where I think many of us might say, look, in this situation, it's more important to be a scourge, to be blunt, to be honest, to speak viscerally and vividly, than it is to try and sort of observe those kind of limits to speech, to only say nice things. And the real question might be for many of us is, where do we set that? It seems to me if you're being mean to everybody, or you think everybody deserves it, you're not contributing much to any conversation. But if you never, ever believe that you'll ever do that, you're probably lying. Michael makes a comment here, yeah.
Do you want to read it, or do you want me to read it?
You go ahead.
Okay, so Michael writes, I disagree that civility is necessarily in opposition to honesty. Civility is about being honest with strangers or others in ways comparable to how we should be honest with friends and members of our primary communities.
Yeah, this is, you know, I mean, I'm very fond of a book by the philosopher Anthony Appiah, who, if you read the New York Times Magazine, has been writing the ethicist column for a while. He was a commencement speaker at Swarthmore a while back, and I've liked his work pretty much ever since I started teaching here. But he had a book called Cosmopolitanism, or Ethics in a World of Strangers, that I think is developing the line of thought that Michael offers there, that that in part, civility is a different thing with a person that you think of as a stranger or outside your community or far away from you or not socially proximate than it is with a friend or a neighbor or a loved one or a family member. That there's an ethics that underlies both of those things, but that we owe the stranger a kind of courtesy that is not just politeness, but is ethics, is about how we create a world where strangers can live together. And there's a lot more that he says in it, but that's attractive to me. And it is precisely why, in a way, one stands at the threshold of a conversation like that one that I linked to from the Daily Caller, where the commenters are all kind of going off on the college and the stupid student wearing the T-shirt and all that sort of stuff. Is in as much as I think of those people as real people and not bots, I'm pretty aware that they're outside my normal discursive community. They're not people I talk to a lot. They are people who are probably all around me, but they're strangers. And so maybe in part, civility in that case is respecting that distance, and not immediately leaping in a way, assuming the familiarity required to be a scourge and say, you guys are being jerks.
Lucy, do you have any closing words as we wrap up this session? I think we just lost. Did we just lose Lucy?
Here we are.
Lucy, do you want to wrap up?
Thank you all so much for joining us. I hope that you'll join us next Wednesday at the same time. We will be led by Professor Jamie Thomas from the Linguistics Department. And
It'll be awesome.
The following week, we will be led on Thursday at 8 o'clock by Sayan Bano from philosophy, right, Tim?
Yeah.
And we will send out an email with readings and with their topics as soon as we have them in hand. And if you have thoughts and ideas and comments you want to share, please email Lisa Schaefer at lschaefer1@swarthmore.edu, which I will now put in the webinar chat for all of you. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure seeing you. And thank you so much, Tim. You're just
my
such
pleasure.
a great star.
It's a great thing to think about. Thanks.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.
All right, I'm gonna drop off.
Good night.
Night. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Tim.
Thank you.